Hello and welcome to my podcast. My name is Nika and I'm an aspiring scientist from the country of Georgia. Today, I'm extremely privileged to host one of the most influential evolutionary biologists of our time, Professor David Haig. Professor Haig is a professor of organismic and evolutionary biology at Harvard University, and his work has had a major influence on how we understand genomic imprinting and the evolutionary conflict. Professor Haig, it's a real pleasure to have you on my podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. To begin with, what first made you interested in the idea that there can be conflicts of interest within the genome itself? Was there a particular observation or problem that made you think biology might be less harmonious than it seemed?
Oh, that goes back a very long time to when I was at least when I was a PhD student in the 1980s. Yeah, it's sort of hard to know why precisely I started thinking of intragenomic conflicts. But the very first paper I ever wrote, it's a very brief one, has a conflict within the genome sitting in it. Reading Richard Dawkins, the extended phenotype, was important for me. In so it to me is a fascinating book that does look quite seriously as genes as being the fundamental units of selection.
Thank you. Uh, you mentioned Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is my idol because I don't remember exactly how old I were when I read his book, The Selfish Gene, but I was amazed by sort of theory of gene-centered evolution. I remember sitting for hours and just putting the information into my mind about how evolution works from that perspective. He's still my idol, and I remember when I was in a reality show, intellectual reality show, and we were asked, "What is your favorite book?" And the first book that came to my mind was The Selfish Gene, and of course, then from Darwin to Derrida by you.
Yeah. So, in fact, on the 15th of September, so that's less than a month away, I'm going to Oxford for a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Selfish Gene. So I'll be seeing Richard at that time, and I will pass on your greeting from Georgia.
Thank you very, very much for that. Actually, as for the selfish gene, I read Richard Dawkins' note that it's not gene is not selfish itself. It's immortal because there were sort of problems with publications because people were telling him to name it the immortal gene, which is in fact true.
Yeah. I don't mind selfish. It was a very um, it sort of roused a lot of people, I think, because of the use of that term. They were thinking of that it was implying that humans were fundamentally selfish. I think one reason why intragenomic conflict is really quite interesting is that there can be that, if genes are the unit of selection, they may be selfish, but we as individuals are not the direct beneficiaries of the evolutionary process, so that there's no, in principle, reason why we should be selfish or cooperative elsewhere. So that, for me, is the way I express it somewhere is that I'm glad that I'm not a unit of selection. That we can put the selfishness down at the genetic level. If we have different sets of genes within ourselves that are trying to push us to in different directions, there is no consensus among our genes on how we should behave. We are the entity that is mediating between all those conflicting pressures. So some of the pressures that are on us are coming from our genes, and some of them are coming from elsewhere, from society or whatever, and somehow we have to muddle through and make decisions. And I think it's the decisions that we make in our life, they're coming from who we are, that are the defining feature of who we are as people and how we are judged by other people.
Thank you. Yeah, as for the selfish gene, it's related to altruism and egoism because if if we perceive evolution from genetical perspective, that's true. And Professor Haig, as for genomic imprinting, we often think of the genome as one unified set of instructions for building an organism. But in fact, genomic imprinting seems to make that picture much more complicated. From that perspective, in terms of that, what is actually happening?
Oh, these are all sorts of reminiscences going back to the 1980s when I was a graduate student in Australia. And I was working on a problem to do with parent-offspring conflict, theory developed by Robert Trivers, actually in seed development in plants. And working on the theory, I found it was simplest for me in doing the mathematics to do the mathematics for the genes of maternal origin, do it for genes of paternal origin, so get predictions that they should behave differently. And then, since I knew what I'd been told in my genetic class that parental origin didn't make a difference, I then at the end put them together, sort of average the maternal and paternal effects to get my prediction. And one day I was in the tea room reading a copy of Nature, and it had an article on memories of mothers and fathers, which talked about genomic imprinting in mice. And that's perhaps one of the most exciting moments in my life because I saw it and said, "Oh, I've got a theory. I've already figured out a theory to explain those sort of differences." So the phenomenon of imprinting is that a gene can be doing different things depending on whether you get it from your mother or from your father. So it isn't anything to do with the sequence of the gene, it's to do with its history, which sex it was in the previous generation. You can think of that as an effect of a past environment, whether it was a male or female body, and that's having an effect on whether the gene is expressed in this generation or not. Um, that it's got nothing to do with the DNA sequence of the gene is shown that the gene I get from my mother, which is doing the maternal thing, if I pass that gene on to my children, they're getting it from their father and it's doing a paternal thing. And so, in a sense, that's where the term imprinting comes from. There is an idea that some mark, the imprint, is put on the gene that says this came from a mother or from a father. That imprint has got to survive through multiple cell divisions, but the imprint can also be erased and reset because, in the example I gave, a gene of mine that has a maternal imprint, when I pass that on to my children, the imprint's got to be erased and the paternal imprint put upon it.
And I think when we talk about sort of uh, the evolution of gametes, the
Yeah.
sperm cells and egg cells, we know that now we are in the natural world, we are witnessing anisogamy, right?
Yes.
But before we had isogamy. So in terms of that, where was genomic imprinting apparent that time? What do you think?
So uh, I think it's much more recent than the origin of eggs and sperm. Um, there isn't much evidence for genomic imprinting in fruit flies, Drosophila, or in nematodes, Caenorhabdites. In fact, there's not much evidence for it in birds or in lizards or fishes, but it occurs in mammals. And oddly, it also occurs in seed plants. So I started off as a botanist. And what do seed plants and mammals have in common? They all of them have parental care, maternal care being provided to the embryo after fertilization, after the sperm has fertilized the egg. And so now there's a disagreement between maternal and paternal genes on how much resources to take from the mother. So if we go back to the example of Drosophila or zebrafish or the Caenorhabdites, the nematode, in all of those species, the amount that the mother is putting into the egg in the form of yolk is determined before the sperm enters the egg. And so there's nothing to argue about. It's already determined how much that offspring is getting. If you're in mammals, which have live birth and they form a placenta, or if you're in seed development, which also you can think of as having live birth and forming a placenta, after the sperm has fertilized the egg, now paternal genes can act to be extracting extra resources from the mother. And so that's the basis of I think, the maternal-paternal conflict that is responsible for the evolution of imprinting, and also explains why it has this odd distribution that it's found in seed plants and in mammals, which at first sight don't have a lot in common.
Thank you. I remember I was puzzling over this a few weeks ago, actually. I was listening to your lecture at Harvard University. I watched a video on YouTube. I think it was at Harvard University, and a student, a girl, actually asked you about this phenomenon that if egg fertilizes egg itself, hypothetically,
Yeah.
is it possible to have genomic imprinting?
Okay. The so in mammals, sperm and egg are non-equivalent um, because of imprinting. And there were some very elegant experiments done in the 1980s where they were taking a mouse egg, so the sperm has entered the egg, but the two nuclei haven't fused, and then you can start swapping nuclei between fertilized eggs. So you can take out a sperm nucleus from here and put in an egg nucleus from another embryo. And so now you're going to produce an embryo that's caused by the fusion of two egg nuclei. So this is going to be an embryo that has two mothers. And in mice, they fail to develop to term. And in particular, they have very poor development of the placental tissues that are the feeding tissues. So this shows that genes of paternal origin are particularly important for development of the placenta, which is the structure taking resources from the mother. You can do the other experiment. You can take out an egg nucleus and you can put in a sperm nucleus. And so when the two sperm nuclei fuse, you're going to produce an embryo with two fathers. And they fail to develop to term. But they show the opposite pattern. They have massive development of the placental tissues and relatively poor development of the embryo. So this is showing that genes of paternal origin in particular are promoting placental development. So those experiments seem to say that you can't produce, in mammals, you can't produce an embryo with two mothers or an embryo with two fathers. There is some Japanese and Korean work more recently where they tamper with some of the imprinted genes. And so in mice, they have been able to produce mice from the fusion of two egg nuclei. And I think they've also, it's a more difficult thing to do to produce mice from the fusion of two sperm nuclei. I happen to know that in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there are startup companies that are wanting to investigate this in humans. And the motivation there is for same-sex couples. And at the moment, if you had two women, they need to, because of imprinting, they need to get a sperm donor from elsewhere. And so, and they would love, some of them would like a child in which they're both the genetic mother of the child. So there's some research money being put into this problem. I think it's actually a lot harder. I think the imprinting problems are a lot more difficult than those people think. But, you know, people are interested in the question at least.
Thank you. And yeah, that's actually very interesting because as humans develop, we have sort of our desires to accomplish goals such as having babies for homosexual couples. And also as within we talked about the gametes and how genomic imprinting occurs in terms of that. So does that same principle, what you just mentioned, apply to parthenogenesis, like genogenesis or androgenesis?
Um, which sort of organisms are you talking about for parthenogenesis?
Mammals.
Ah, so there are, um, no naturally parthenogenetic mammals. There are parthenogenetic lizards. You can produce parthenogenetic chickens. You know, and I think the reason why it doesn't occur is partly an imprinting effect. However, uh, what what's going on with Dolly? So Dolly was the cloned sheep. So I think what happened with Dolly is in Dolly they get an egg, they take out the egg nucleus, and then they put in a nucleus from a cell in the body of another sheep. I think they in fact used mammary tissue. So they got a nucleus from a mammary cell and they put that into the egg. And then it started to develop and it produced Dolly, who was a cloned sheep. Um, and I think that was possible because the nucleus that they took from the mammary gland had the appropriate imprints. It had both a maternal and a paternal set of genes. And so that allowed development in that case. So that would be a case where you're producing an embryo that just has one mother, getting all of its genes from just one female. So it's a different thing from the previous case where you're putting two haploid, to use a technical term, chromosomes together to produce an embryo with two mothers. It's important to note that in cloning, in sheep and cattle, uh, that there's a very high frequency of what is called large offspring syndrome. So some of them get born that they develop large placentas and have high birth weight. And it appears to be that this is a problem of imprinted genes. So in the cloning process, sometimes you get appropriate imprints. Sometimes they're not fully not fully preserved, and so you get a variety of problems in that way.
As you mentioned, the gene-centered evolution and genomic imprinting, I really want to ask this question. Uh, Professor Haig, you described conflicts between maternal and paternal genes. If we think of the genome almost as a negotiation between different interests, what are those interests actually trying to achieve? And also, whose interests ultimately win?
So let's take imprinting's an interesting one because the two sides are fairly evenly matched. You're getting a full set of genes from mother and a full set from father, and so it isn't the case that one's a clear majority and the other's a minority. The theory really explains that there is a conflict, and how that conflict's going to be resolved. You really need to start looking at the details of what's going on. You know, it's a balance of power. To use a topical example, across the Black Sea from Georgia, uh, we understand there's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but it's and we can define the opposing interests, but predicting the outcome and who is going to win, or whether it's going to be some sort of negotiated truth, or whether it's just going to be a conflict that sort of continues indefinitely. Those are very difficult questions to decide because they're determined by idiosyncratic details of really what's happening on the ground, what's happening in the economies of the two countries, what's happening in the minds of the citizenry. And similarly, I think in these internal intragenomic conflicts, I think I can explain what are the things being argued about.
Please.
Um, amount of resources, whether the baby sleeps through the night or whether the baby wakes up through the night. There's evidence of imprinting effects on that. And not surprisingly, paternal genes are tending to wake the child up during the night, and maternal genes are trying to keep it asleep. I find that a particularly beautiful example. Um, the sleep is actually an interesting condition that there's conflict, I think, between maternal and paternal genes over child sleep. And so after birth, child sleep is described as disorganized and somewhat chaotic. It's not a regular rhythm, that the child is waking up sometimes, falling asleep in unpredictable sort of ways. And then, and it gets described as the sleep matures, and so the child settles down and now has much more regular sleep. And I think this is actually an expression of the very early sleep of the child is a site of conflict, and we can talk about where that conflict is coming from. And then after a while, um, the conflict dies down. There's no longer a conflict, and so you get nice regular sleep, concord, and peace within the genome. I think where the conflict arises in that case is, well, I'll ask you a question. When you talk to new mothers who've just had a baby, what is almost the first thing they tell you?
Babies cry.
Babies cry, and in my experience, I am so tired that they feel
I'm
really, really.
exhausted. They are
I
constant
am.
whiners, the
I
greatest
am.
whiners.
Yes, I am exhausted, and it's partly because of fragmented sleep. I think That is an adaptation of the paternal genes of the child to make the mother exhausted. Because if she's tired and exhausted, it takes longer before she returns to fertility and conceives a younger brother or sister. And when that younger brother or sister comes upon, she's got to divide her attention between the older child and the new child that's come along. And for paternal genes, they favor delaying that birth of the next child, because that next child might actually have a different father from them, because there is some degree of partner change, that women sometimes have children by more than one father.
Uh, we talked about cooperation and conflict during pregnancy, and pregnancy usually presented as an extraordinary example of cooperation between mother and fetus. But your work, Professor Haig, suggests that cooperation can also involve conflict, as we mentioned before. How can two organisms, or two genomes, for instance, cooperate and compete at the same time? And also, in biology, is conflict necessarily a bad thing?
So the example I sometimes use when people say, is it a cooperative relationship or is it a conflictual relationship? And I would say um, most relationships have a bit of both. I ask people, is a marriage harmonious or is it conflictual? And when you think about that, I'm sure you know marriages that are full of conflicts and marriages that are relatively harmonious. But I think that in all marriages, occasionally, there are conflicts that come about. So it's not it's harmonious or it's conflictual, that in any complex relationship, there are elements of both. I think if I'm how old am I now? I'm 68. I think I'm remembering it right. And my heart has been working well for 68 years, and my liver has been working well for 68 years, and my kidney has been working well for 68 years. And that's, the beauty of natural selection, that these organ systems have evolved to function well most of the time. So there's a puzzle there in pregnancy. Why is pregnancy different? So at first sight, if pregnancy were cooperative, it's really central to fitness. It should work even better than my heart or my liver or my kidneys do. But that's not true. We all know that there are a whole series of complications and difficulties that come during pregnancy. It's now standard that when a woman becomes pregnant, that she books into a hospital before she gives birth, anticipating the possibility of problems. I don't book into hospital for, 9 months ahead for a problem with my heart or with my lungs or my kidneys. So why is the difference? And the difference is because the maternal pregnancy involves an interaction between two different genetic individuals. In the interaction between my heart and my lung and my brain, these are all just in one individual, that to a first approximation, we're all on the same side. In pregnancy, you've got two genetic individuals that share some of their genes in common. So that's a set of genes that the fetus gets from its mother, but they also have some genes that are different. The set of genes the fetus gets from its father. And so that is the source of both cooperation and conflict within the relationship. And, to think about Ukraine and Russia at the moment. You know, the Ukrainian people and the Russian people actually have a lot of common interests. They would be better off not being in this conflict at the moment. And yet there are, a lot of terrible costs associated with the conflict, because coming to an agreement in the midst of conflict is difficult. And I think the same thing is happening during human pregnancy, that there's a lot of common interest, but coming to an agreement is difficult, partly because messages that are exchanged between the two sides cannot always be taken at face value, because both sides have evolutionary incentives to send misleading messages. In consequence of that, messages tend not to be believed in a metaphorical sense. So I think one of the problems in pregnancy is that despite textbooks talking about the amazing exchange of signals between mother and fetus, that there is actually relatively little communication taking place, or the communication is more attempts to persuade um, the mother to do things that the mother might not do on her own.
Thank you.
It's concerned with health, and so there it does make a difference. There are good kinds of variation when you're healthy, and bad kinds of variation when you're not healthy. There's a little bit of a linguistic problem there. When you talk about health of people, you talk about them being fit. If you do lots of exercise, that you're physically fit, you have fitness. And in evolutionary biology, they also talk about fitness, but in evolutionary biology, fitness is how many copies of your genes get transmitted to the future generations. The same word is used, but it's actually referring to different sorts of concepts. And at times that can be that can create occasional problems, that people are talking about evolutionary fitness. Somebody's talking about transmission of genes for fitness, and somebody else is talking about, the strength of your muscles or something like that. I think it's so the tradition of science is that one asks questions of mechanism, how does something happen? And one doesn't ask the question, why, what is it for? Why has it evolved? I think this goes back to the very origin of the scientific revolution, that people said that the how question was scientific, whereas the why question, that was sort of that was an almost religious, unscientific question. But in fact, the question why, what is something for, what is its purpose, is absolutely central to understanding anything that happens in the body. Can you imagine cardiology if you didn't understand that the heart is a pump for moving blood around the body? That's its purpose. That is what it's for. And William Harvey, when he discovered the circulation of the blood, was distinctly using teleological language. This is the purpose of a thing. If in medicine, if we we have all sorts of ideas about what the different parts of the body, what their appropriate function should be. I think where it comes into problem is where people think that they understand what the function of something is, like the placenta, for example, and they have a poor evolutionary model of what the placenta has evolved to do. And so that's sort of a situation where I would like some more sophistication of the evolutionary thought of clinicians. Where evolutionary thinking has come into medicine, for example, is in cancer biology. So now we have cells that are starting to reproduce um, against what is good for the body. That's an evolutionary process, and evolutionary ideas have developed there. Why was asking the why question the question of purpose? It was largely rejected by physicists and chemists um, because when you're dealing with physics, chemistry, things happen, but they don't have reasons, they don't have purposes. And so purposes were, put out there into the realm of the supernatural or even religion. I think Charles Darwin showed how a mindless, purposeless process, which is natural selection, it doesn't have a goal, it doesn't have any end in mind, can give rise to organisms like you and me who do things for good reasons, who have purposive behavior. So I think Charles Darwin is the great unrecognized physicist of the 19th century.
Uh, there's a book of Daniel Dennett. He passed away some time ago, unfortunately, but I've read his sort of statement about Darwin, and he said that the origin of species by means of natural selection is the greatest idea anybody has ever proposed.
Yeah. My dear friend Dan Dennett. So Dad lived in Boston, and so we were friends over many years, and I do miss him. We we were in agreement on this. We think that the idea of natural selection is what unifies the world of mechanisms, of how questions, with the world of purposes and doing things for good reason. So we sort of think it's the grand unifying theory that puts those two things together. How purposeful beings can arise in a world that doesn't have a purpose or meaning.
Thank you. Professor Haig, you've spent decades doing science and watching the field and the scientific community change. For someone at the beginning of that journey, what do you wish you had understood about becoming a scientist when you were my age? Because I want to become a scientist, and what advice would you give to me?
I think you've got to follow what what you care about and what really interest you. So I encourage my students to take on not necessarily fashionable questions, but questions they find interesting. Uh, it's not always the best advice for getting a job. People who are interested in what's the currently fashionable question, that's often a more effective strategy. I think you only have one life. And so in your one life, you should do what you care about and which is what is intriguing to you. I have colleagues who disagree with that, who say that you should first of all be considering what is marketable, first of all, more importantly than what are you really interested in. Um, one's got to make those choices. Going back to my PhD, I was working on the very obscure field of parent-offspring conflict in seed development, just because I found it fascinating.
At Cambridge.
No, at Macquarie University
In
in
Australia.
Australia. Um, and it turned out to give rise to a theory of genomic imprinting, which was important for molecular biologists. It turned out to become relevant to diseases of pregnancy. Um, and I was sort of lucky that I had the right idea at the right time. It also, my working on an obscure field actually got me a fellowship and then eventually got me a job that I now have at Harvard. So life is full of all sorts of unpredictable contingencies. So perhaps my advice would be, um, yes, listen to Professor Haig, the idealist, but also listen to your other professors who are pragmatists, and a balance between the pragmatic and the idealistic uh, might be the best advice for a successful career in science.
Thank you. Professor Haig, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me. It has been a real privilege to have this conversation with you, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to learn from you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Nika, and my greetings to everybody in Georgia, which I'm told is a rather beautiful area in the world. Take care.
Thank you.